Do you ever head out for a day's wildlife photography, have a fantastic day out, come back, look at the images on the back of your computer and are a little bit disappointed? They're not really quite what you thought they'd be? Well, these could be some of the reasons why. So the first thing you need to consider is the light. Now, we all know that you need light to actually take a photograph, but what I'm more interested in today is the quality of the light. So if you were out on that day's photography and you had a really dull day, what you might find is that when you take a look at your images and try and look closely at the things like feather detail or fur detail, you might find that there's not an awful lot of detail there. It looks a little bit smudgy, a little bit, you know, just the real fine detail isn't there. And that's really because the amount of light and the quality of light is not really getting into that detail and pulling it all out for you, like you would do if you had some really bright light. And there's not really an awful lot you can do about that. Now, the opposite as well, like if you've got a day like today, you're going to get all that detail. But the problem you have on a day like today is that this sort of light really can cast some awful shadows on your subject. So for instance, a bird in flight, if you take a picture of it and that wing comes across the body, you'll often get a really dark shadow coming across the body, obviously taking out any detail that you've got there at all. Now, I'd prefer to shoot in that type of light than the really dull day, because at least you're getting that detail in places, although you've got those really harsh shadows to deal with. My preference for shooting is to have a really bright day like today, but some really light cloud over the sun. So it provides like a softbox really for the light. And what you're getting in that instance is you're getting all the qualities of the really bright light, picking out all that detail on your subject, but you're not getting those harsh shadows. The shadows aren't there at all if you get that absolute right quality of light. So that's my preference, to shoot in that type of weather. So always look for those type of conditions if you're going out shooting, and that's one thing that you can do to ensure that you really have got that detail on your subject. Now, something I see an awful lot, particularly with beginners when I take them out doing days out doing photography, is that they're not always using the correct focus mode. And I think it's something to do with the marketing hype around cameras will always emphasise the camera's got 650 focus points and it covers all the viewfinder or 90% of the viewfinder or whatever. And I think people sometimes feel that because they've got them, they've got to use them. Now, I hardly ever use all the focus points on my camera. The most I'll use is for birds in flight. And if I do use them all, it'll be for things like swifts or swallows or hobbies, really fast flying birds that are prompt at changing direction on an instant, so that I really need the whole viewfinder to try and keep it in focus. For most subjects, you don't really need an awful lot of focus points. So normally for birds in flight, I'll just use a central section. For sort of slower, more predictable birds. For things like mammals or whatever that are on the floor, I'll generally, myself, this is my preference, use one focus point. And I know these days we've got things on a lot of cameras like animal detection and bird detection and animal and bird eye detection, and I will use that, but however, that is not always the best method to use. For instance, I was taking some images the other day. I was laid down in long grass on a flood bank, and about 20 metres in front of me was a roe deer also laid down on the flood bank, enjoying the afternoon sun, and we'd both got grass all in front of our bodies and faces, and I was shooting through that trying to get a picture of the roe deer. Now, in that instance, I was using a different camera that had got animal eye detect, really top of the range camera and lens setup, and it just could not lock onto the eye. It was just all over the place. So what I ended up doing was switching the camera quickly to manual focus and using the focus peaking to get onto the actual animal and the eye of the animal, and then taking my shots that way. So really what I'm saying is you need to look at the situation you're in and pick the correct focusing mode for that situation. You'll then avoid a lot of situations where if you're trying to shoot shots like that, or really busy areas where you're trying to take a picture of a bird, it can fool the autofocus and it can flip onto the foreground or the background really quickly while you're taking the shots. You don't realise until you get back and you realise that the bird actually isn't in full focus, it's something slightly behind the bird or something slightly in front of the bird. So always try and use the appropriate focus mode for the subject that you're shooting. Now, something I see a lot as well is that people crop their images too much to get a bigger subject. And I think it's just really one of the laws of physics that unless you are close to your subject, you'll lose a lot of detail. So take a look at this image here of a roe deer that I took years and years ago now, but I took it with my Canon 70D and a 100-400 lens. Now in this instance, the deer saw something laid down in a field and wanted to know what it was and approached me and got within about 7 meters, and you can see all the detail on this. Now I'm pretty sure that if I would not have got as close to that deer as I did on this occasion, and it was say 20-25 meters away, and I'd then cropped the image with my current setup, this 40 megapixel sensor, I wouldn't have got the same detail on the image as I have here. So really there's two things to take into account there. One is the fact that if you can get close enough to your subject, any camera from the last 10 years will give you a stunning image. You don't have to have the latest kit. But again, if you've got kit like this, then don't always rely on cropping to get that image, because you just won't get the same detail. That fine detail will all be lost, rather than getting close to your subject, and that will retain all that fine detail. Now, something else I think is really important is that you get to know your camera kit. Now that might seem like a strange thing to say, but the more you use your kit, you'll find out that particularly your lens will have a sweet spot. So what that really means is that at a certain aperture, you'll get your sharpest images. So there also is a tendency these days to want to shoot wide open so that you get this lovely bokeh in the background. And that isn't always the sharpest point for your camera. So for instance, this Sony 200 to 600, my copy, I'm fairly happy to shoot at f7.1 all the time because it is pin sharp. I will shoot at f6.3 if I need some extra light, but it's just not quite as sharp. So learn to know your lens definitely and what it shoots best at, so that again you can get the most out of it, but also learn how to use your camera kit and which functions you need and which functions that you don't. Because again, that can have an effect on the quality of the images that you're turning out, because the more you're comfortable with the kit and how to use it, the more you'll get those shots. You won't miss those shots because you're on straight away, you know where everything works, which button does what. If you need to change something on the fly, you can do it really quickly. Now, a good example of knowing your kit would be something like exposure compensation. Now that's really important because certain subjects you need to lighten up and certain subjects you need to darken down. So for instance, a good example would be, you might be photographing birds in flight and you've got a really bright sky and you've got a dark bird that you're photographing. Well, in that instance, you would want to lighten up your bird, so put some plus on the exposure compensation, maybe 1 or maybe 1.5, so that you don't lose all that detail in the dark bird. You know, you're more happy to blow out the sky a little bit so that you've got that detail in the bird that's showing up. But then a couple of seconds later, you could have something like a great white egret, for instance, fly in front of you on a light sky. Now, if you're still on a plus on the exposure compensation, you're going to blow out all the detail in that bird completely. You might need to darken it down. So having those controls and knowing exactly where they are and how to operate them will just give you so much more chance of getting those shots and not getting home and being disappointed. And the final tip that I think can drastically improve your images or ruin your images is either not editing them at all, or not knowing how to edit them for whatever media that you're putting the image out on. So what I mean by that is, firstly, I would advise anybody always to shoot in RAW. And the reason I say that is, anybody who can think back to film days, if you've got a raw image, that's like your negative. So as you'll know, if you've got a negative, you can take that into the darkroom and you can swap it and change it and use different chemicals to completely change the look of that image that you're going to print out eventually. Now, if you don't use that negative and if that's your raw image, I would say the JPEG is the printed image that you get at. So you can imagine if a JPEG is that printed image, you're then trying to make changes to it, make it bigger or whatever, or change the sharpening or whatever you're doing, changing the colours. It's very difficult to do it. So bringing that into the modern world, using a JPEG, your camera is doing a lot of that sharpening and stuff in camera for you, which you don't always want it to do, because a good example of this is if you're posting images on Instagram, when you sharpen that image, you have to sharpen it a certain way so that it looks great on Instagram. If you then love that image so much you want to print it off, if you have got a JPEG and it's set up and it looks great on Instagram, if you try and print that, potentially, and more than likely, if you print an A3 copy of it, it's going to look awful. And the reason for that is that when you're doing images for print, you really have to over sharpen them, because if you don't, what happens is when the image is printed, although it's only minute, the colours bleed in across each other and it makes the image fuzzy. So by over sharpening, what you're doing is you're compensating for that. Now if you're using a JPEG, it's very difficult to do that after the effect. So shooting in RAW is really the first step to taking control of what your finished image is going to look like. And again, something that has changed over the last probably 5 years is the ability of not only cameras to handle ISO, but also software that we now have that can really drastically improve images that have got high ISO. Now, if you take a look at this image of a short-eared owl, I shot this last year at 12,800 ISO. Now, 5 years ago, I wouldn't have even attempted to take a shot at 12,800 ISO. And if I had accidentally done it, it would have gone straight in the bin. But this one I put through DxO Pure Raw and it just transformed it. You know, it was absolutely stunning. It was the image I saw when I saw that bird coming towards me. And the noise reduction software really just does an excellent job these days. So learn to edit, learn how to use things like noise reduction, and you'll find that images that do look like, yeah, we can't do anything with it, you can actually pull a nice image out of there. So we can't really do anything about the light we've got on the day. That's something that we've just got to do the best we can with, and then change our settings as much as we can to get the best out of it on that day. But the other things we certainly can work on and get better at. And I think if you do, you'll find that there's a definite uplift in the images that you're producing. And in the end, that's what we all want. We all want to get better at photography. And those simple things really, over time, they won't cost you anything, just really your time working on it. So do a little bit every week, whether it's image processing, shooting in RAW, getting to know your camera a little bit better and your lens, and maybe test it, see where you think it's at its sharpest, and you will see an improvement in your images. So anyway, I hope that's been useful to you. I'll see you next time for another one.